I'd like to welcome all of you here today. For those of you, has everyone been to the Hope and Healing Center before for something? Okay, well, we're an outreach primarily in mental health, of which aging is one category. And we have more than 40 support groups that meet here every week. We have classes all the time, including those for folks who need continuing education units. We have mental health coaching, and we have research. And I'm Peggy Datermeyer. I'm the Bioethics and Aging Fellow. And so that's how I happen to be fortunate enough to be introducing my good friend Julie Kutac today. Want to remind you, as we're flipping through the slides a few minutes ago, we have programs going on. We have another aging program this Thursday. The reason we ended up with 2 in 1 week was because this one got frozen out back in January when we had the ice storm. So that will be on Medicare and Medicaid and the differences in those programs. You laugh, it's important to know. And then we have a program in March on grieving, and we have a program in April on end-of-life decision-making. So please keep an eye out for those in our program, and we look forward to seeing you back for some of those programs. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, who's Dr. Julie Kutac. And with 2 beloved grandmothers who had dementia, she has a long personal dedication to serving persons with cognitive decline. She holds a master's degree from Rice in Religious Studies, and she has a doctorate from the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston in Medical Humanities. With 15 years in higher education and medical school settings, including a 2-year National Institute of Aging pre-doc fellowship, Dr. Kutac maintains a professional focus on elder care. She works as the professional education and research specialist for the Alzheimer's Association for the Houston and Southeast chapters. In this role, she educates healthcare professionals, organizes conferences, and liaises with scientists in the Texas Medical Center. So you're in for a treat today, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Kutac. Thank you.
Okay, I turned that off because I'm already mic'd up. Is everything, can y'all hear me? Okay, I've got a big mouth anyway, so it won't be hard to hear me, I hope. Well, thank you to Peggy and thank you to Hope and Healing for inviting the Alzheimer's Association here today to speak. It's my privilege and honor to get to talk with y'all about the latest research. And what Peggy didn't share with you, and I hope she doesn't mind, is that we were doctoral students together down at the University of Texas Medical Branch, and we've worked together since we've graduated, and so it's really wonderful to kind of come full circle and be here in the next phase of our careers. So like Peggy said in my introduction, I am the professional education and research specialist at the Alzheimer's Association, and so I educate healthcare providers and community members in a lot of different areas. So I want this to be a time where you get your questions answered, but we are going to focus primarily on the research and the latest research. Now, there's no way that I can talk about everything that's going on in research because it's really accelerating. And I'm going to show you some of the milestones that have occurred historically, and you'll see how the majority of the research has really been compressed into the last 10 to 15 years. But I'll do my best to organize it and hit the highlights where when you leave today, you'll be able to say, these are the vanguard developments in these 3 areas. Okay, so that's where we're going. There are no surprises. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the Alzheimer's Association supports research. And then we'll talk about cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. We'll do this as we're talking about the milestones in research developments. And then the way that the program is organized is that we're going to talk about it in 3 broad categories in terms of what we understand about the risk for developing Alzheimer's and the ways that you can lower risk. We'll talk about research developments in terms of detecting and diagnosing Alzheimer's and early detection. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the clinical trial pipeline and what's going on in clinical trials. So, not to frighten anyone, but I usually do start the presentation with statistics just to get a handle on what a significant public health crisis Alzheimer's disease is. It's currently the 6th leading cause of death. It kills more than breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. There are an estimated between 5 and 5.4 million Americans who are living with Alzheimer's disease. And that number could fill NRG Stadium 75 times. So if any of y'all have been caught in rodeo traffic,
5 million traffic,
to think about that number on such a huge scale. But what's even more troubling about that is that for every 1 person with Alzheimer's, there are generally 3 unpaid caregivers. So for 5 million people living with Alzheimer's, that means there are 15 million caregivers in the United States. It's the most expensive disease. And last year, our 2018 Alzheimer's Association facts and figures will be coming out in early March. So keep an eye out. These are the 2017 statistics. That estimation was correct. In 2017, the disease cost the nation approximately $259 billion.
1.1
so
trillion side.
That number is only going to skyrocket. When I first started working at the association, the number was that someone develops Alzheimer's every 67 seconds. That's now down to 66 seconds. And I'm curious to see what the new statistics are going to be when they come out. Alzheimer's prevalence rates will increase all over the country, and the darker the purple, the higher the rate. And so you can see Texas is going to be significantly affected. So these numbers are
Research
terrifying
is the only way we're going
to
to
me.
stop.
And the other thing is that there's a face that goes with every single one of these huge numbers. These numbers that are mind-boggling, there are stories and people and families who are affected. So research is the only way that we're going to stop Alzheimer's disease. I look at this slide, and you can read it in a couple of different ways. So on the one hand, Alzheimer's disease is increasing as a cause of death. This is the percentage change in selected causes of death between 2000 and 2014. And while other causes of death, like breast cancer, prostate cancer, heart disease, stroke, and HIV, have all gone down, the incidence of Alzheimer's as a cause of death have increased significantly. But I read this slide in another way, in a more hopeful way. We historically have turned our attention towards breast cancer. In the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, we turned our attention towards HIV. Scientists look at heart disease, and we understand so much more about heart disease. I truly think that if we collectively turn our attention culturally and at the policy level and with scientists all working in concert together, we can make significant strides. So I think we're moving. I think we're currently in that time. And so it's an exciting time to be involved in Alzheimer's work. So this is the mission of the Alzheimer's Association. Everything that we do is in service to this mission. And the first part of the mission is to eliminate Alzheimer's disease through the advancement of research. Now, until we get to that cure or that disease-modifying treatment, we must be standing with and walking with families who are affected. So the second part is to provide an enhanced care and support for all who are affected. The third part of the mission is in relationship to the other two, and that's to reduce the risk of dementia through the promotion of brain health. And I'll show you when we get into the weeds of the research just how science is working to help reduce risk. And this is our vision. So this is what we're all working towards. So the Alzheimer's Association has several strategic priorities. I won't go into these in great depth, but they're all in service of meeting the first part of the mission, which is to eliminate Alzheimer's disease through the advancement of research. Alzheimer's disease is historically underfunded in comparison to other types, other disease processes. And so one of our strategic priorities is to let our policymakers know that Alzheimer's disease is a public health crisis and needs our attention. So we advocate. And then we use our advocacy message to help drive the way that research is funded. So the Alzheimer's Association is the largest nonprofit funder of Alzheimer's research in the world. We're the third most impactful funder of Alzheimer's research in the world after the National Institutes of Health and the Chinese government. So we put our money where our mouth is, and in terms of actually supporting Alzheimer's research. Our policymakers, in an exciting turn, have been steadily increasing the amount of money that they allocate towards research. So they've now reached almost $1 billion that's funded towards a single disease entity. This is really, really important. I mean, I actually don't really love talking about money. I'd much rather talk about the ideas and what the research says, but we have to help our scientists be able to keep their labs moving. So we advance research, and we advance research in a number of ways. We fund research, but we do a number of other things. We have the largest Alzheimer's Association conference in the world, the Alzheimer's Association International Conference. Last year it was in London. This year, it's going to be in Chicago. It goes back and forth between the different continents. There were almost 6,000 scientists in London this year, converging to talk about the latest research. There are at least 15, I haven't actually counted, but different subtopics that they're looking at. So they're looking at genetics, they're looking at biomarkers, they're looking at neuroimaging, they're looking at clinical therapeutics. So people are looking at it from lots of different angles. So here is a picture of one of the plenary sessions at AAIC this year. Over 65 countries were represented, so it's a huge event. And again, I think it's really exciting to show that the scientists are coming together, and they are really working. You don't hear about it as much, but they are working behind the scenes. We have a journal, a peer-reviewed journal. It's the largest, most impactful journal on Alzheimer's disease. And the way that the Alzheimer's Association funds research is that it generally funds emerging scholars who are doing high-risk, high-reward research. So here's a little pop quiz. What is the general age when someone makes their Nobel Prize winning discovery. Now, they don't get the Nobel Prize until they're much older. Yeah, young, early 30s, late 20s, early 30s. When does a person generally get their first R01 grant from the NIH? Not quite, but they're usually in their 40s. And you generally need research results to get the grants. So the Alzheimer's Association is nimble enough that we can provide these smaller seed grants to help scientists get started. And then that can be generally transitioned into a larger NIH grant. We're currently funding about $1 million within the Texas Medical Center right now. And one of our scientists, Dr. Rodrigo Morales at UT Health, just got announced for a new 3-year grant. And he's working on protein aggregation in the brain, and we'll talk about what that means. Okay, so let's talk about some milestones in Alzheimer's research. So here's Dr. Alois Alzheimer. In 1906, here's the first patient to have Alzheimer's disease clinically described. Certainly not the first person to ever have Alzheimer's disease. That goes back to the ancient Greeks and far earlier. But this was Alois Alzheimer's lab, and he met Augusta, who was in her early 50s, and she has what's understood now to be early onset Alzheimer's disease. So she was under the age of 65, and she said that she felt like she was losing herself. After she died, Dr. Alzheimer looked at her brain underneath the microscope because this was a real time of scientific discovery. It was a very exciting time. New stains were being developed, and scientists could look at tissue under the microscope in ways that they had never been able to do before. And what he found were what is still considered to be the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, which are namely plaques and tangles. So plaques form through an aggregation, an accumulation of a protein that has kind of gone rogue called beta amyloid. So beta amyloid gets clipped and becomes sticky and starts to aggregate. And it sticks to itself and sticks to itself and sticks to itself. And it forms these bony plaques within the brain tissue. So the brain is about the consistency of Jell-O, and these plaques are as hard as bone. These are not the same kind of plaques when you hear about atherosclerotic plaques in the heart. It's a different medium. They're made out of different things. So the plaques happen in between the nerve cells. The tangles are formed from a different protein called tau. And tau is part of the microtubule structure of the cell. So it's almost like it's a mini skeleton inside the cell. And cells are long and branched. Tau gets hyperphosphorylated and becomes very heavy, and it collapses. And the long nerve cell then tangles up, and underneath the microscope you can see it looks like a hair tangle under the microscope. So that's where you get the terms plaques and tangles. Now, plaques and tangles are generally considered to be the hallmarks and what happens in the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. I went to the NANCE National Alzheimer's Center Symposium, and there, the latest research, like last Friday, was talking about how tau can actually exit the cell. So this is new. So there's still so much that we don't understand even about the basic biology of Alzheimer's disease. Scientists are also looking at ways that the blood vessels may leak. ways that insulin becomes resistant in the brain. So there are lots of different angles and factors to look at. So 1906, we don't see a whole lot until 1968, when there was the development of the cognitive measurement scales. Now, 8 years later, Alzheimer's is named as the most common form of dementia. Through this scale and other tests, we start to see that dementia is an umbrella term. And we can look specifically at different types of dementia. But all of these types of dementia are still understood by looking at the brain on autopsy. You'll see that Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, at between 50 and 75%. And then come the less common forms of dementia, like vascular dementia that occurs through a series of tiny strokes inside the brain, blood loss in the brain. Dementia with Lewy bodies, which actually is an aggregation of a different type of protein, alpha-synuclein. And then frontotemporal dementias that have significant behavioral changes associated with them. Many forms of dementia are mixed. So someone may have Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. We're very lucky in Houston to have different centers of excellence that can piece apart the different types of dementia through their diagnostics. So we're very lucky in that way. So here's what we've learned about Alzheimer's. It's universally fatal. It's not a normal part of aging.
Alzheimer's
People don't develop a touch of Alzheimer's. And it affects more than just memory. It actually causes the entire brain to fail. So it causes the part of the brain that controls vision, that controls balance and movement, that controls executive functioning, and eventually the part of the brain that controls involuntary movements like swallowing and breathing and the heartbeat. A very small number of people have inherited forms of Alzheimer's. And a lot of people say, my mom had Alzheimer's, my grandmother had Alzheimer's, my uncle had Alzheimer's. Am I going to get it too? And that's one of the things that scientists are looking very closely at to understand genetic risk. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But this inherited form that they're talking about is very, very rare. It actually only occurs in about 3% of cases. This is the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's. So the Alzheimer's Association supports the DIAN-2 study, which is the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's network trial unit. Okay, so these families for which dominantly inherited Alzheimer's is a part of their genetic makeup, scientists are looking very closely to see what we can learn about them. That's only 3% of the cases. And you may have heard about the family in Colombia, where almost everyone in the family has Alzheimer's. That means that 97% of Alzheimer's is sporadic, meaning we don't exactly know what causes it. We don't exactly know what causes that beta amyloid to start being clipped and to become sticky. We don't exactly understand what happens with tau and why Alzheimer's starts. So right now, what we know is that if you have a brain, you're at risk for developing Alzheimer's. That's scary. And that includes me. And like Peggy said, I had two grandmothers who both had dementia. One had vascular, one had Alzheimer's. And it's oppressing me. The vast majority of people with the disease develop late onset, meaning that they develop symptoms after the age of 65. But there are 200,000 Americans who are living with younger onset Alzheimer's disease, meaning that the symptoms emerge before the age of 65. Often, the earlier that it emerges, the more aggressive it is. And there is, now, it may not be dominantly inherited, but there is a genetic component to Alzheimer's. We'll talk about that a little bit more. We can talk about it now. So there are different kinds of genes. There are genes that determine things, and there are genes for which there's risk. So if I'm determined, if I have this deterministic gene, I'm definitely going to get something. Like, it is determined, and I don't know how many genes code for curly hair. I don't know. But it is determined that this hair is curly, and there's no flat iron in the world that can make it not happen. It's determined. Now, there are also risk genes. And if, say, for example, I eat a cheeseburger every day, which sounds delicious, then I'm at risk for having heart disease, right? But there are always those people who achieve great longevity, and then they attribute it to eating a cheeseburger every day, you know? There are just some people who get lucky. And it's the same with Alzheimer's. There are genes, the apolipoprotein, ApoE4 increases your risk of developing Alzheimer's. If you have one copy, you inherit copies of genes from your mom and your dad. So you have 2 copies of your genes. If you inherit 1 copy, you're at a risk. If you inherit 2 copies, you're at a much greater risk. Now, the ApoE3 gene, which is a different variation on the same gene, actually has a protective, I think ApoE3 is neutral and ApoE2 has a protective effect, or it might be reversed. We'll double check me on that. So you can see, even if you have the risk genes, you still might not develop it. So it again becomes very complicated. So in it's just 1976 that dementia was understood to be this category term. And what we didn't talk about is that the National Institute of Aging was only developed in 1974. In 1980, the Alzheimer's Association was founded. Here's our founder, Jerome Stone. Here he is with President Reagan. And he was a caregiver for his wife and was looking for resources that he couldn't find in the community, so he started the association. In 1984 was the discovery of beta amyloid and tau. That's not that long ago. And the first drug to treat Alzheimer's disease was approved by the FDA in 1993. The drugs that are on the market right now do not change the pathology of the disease. They don't stop the plaques and the tangles from forming. What they do help with is they help the neurons communicate better with one another. So nerve cells are long and they're branched, and there are 100 billion of them inside the brain. We are all walking miracles, 100 billion nerve cells doing trillions of activities. And they talk to each other using neurotransmitters and electricity. And what the drugs do is help those neurotransmitters connect. So they help the nerve cells talk to each other. But once a nerve cell dies, there's no bringing it back. So that's another challenge to scientists. In 1989, the association developed awarded a grant that developed a mouse model of a rare neurodegenerative disorder, and that has led the way to animal modeling of Alzheimer's disease. In 1993, that ApoE4 gene was identified. And in 1995, the first transgenic mouse model was announced. And now things start to get busy, right? So I told you before, that's just 1995, so that's 05, 15, 23 years ago. You'll see how things start to accelerate quickly. In 2003, the National Alzheimer's Disease Genetics Study begins. In 2004, Pittsburgh Compound B was announced at the Alzheimer's Association's precursor to the international conference, and the Alzheimer's Association began the Neuroimaging Initiative. This is a really big step right here, because now we're moving into a new scientific revolution, where before you could only look at the brain on autopsy and look at the brain stained underneath the slides. With the development of PIB, of Pittsburgh Compound B, now scientists and clinicians can look at the brain in real time. So these compounds bind to beta amyloid, and now you can see that there's beta amyloid in the brain before the person dies. In 2005, the Alzheimer's and Dementia Journal was launched. And in 2008, which we haven't talked about this, ISTART was formed, the International Society to Advance Alzheimer's Research. There's a T in there. But that's the academic home for Alzheimer's researchers. In 2009, there was an effort to begin to standardize biomarkers, the ways that we can look at different bodily fluids to try and diagnose Alzheimer's disease earlier. The Alzheimer's Association International Conference becomes annual, just in 2009. In 2010, TrialMatch launched. Every single one of you got a TrialMatch card. What TrialMatch is the Alzheimer's Association's way to help accelerate research. So the only way we move forward with clinical research is to have volunteers. And so the Alzheimer's Association supports a database that has clinical trials in that database. Every clinical trial has gone through institutional review board review. So so human subjects are protected. And every study is also on clinicaltrials.gov. But how many of you in this room, myself included, have time to go look through the 300 trials that are on clinicaltrials.gov to see how you could get involved? I don't have that kind of time. So what TrialMatch does is that you fill out a profile, and then it pairs you with trials that you're eligible for. Not all are drug trials. Some are stress trials. Some are just online surveys that you fill out. And signing up for TrialMatch doesn't mean that you're signing up for a trial. You're just going to get more information about trials, and then you can decide. The last drug that was approved by the FDA that's not on this slide, was in 2003. 2003. So it's been 15 years since a new drug has gone to market. And if we don't have people volunteering for those trials, then we'll never get a new drug. So the Alzheimer's Association supports TrialMatch. In 2011, thanks to our advocacy efforts, the National Alzheimer's Plan Act was enacted to say that we would have a disease-modifying treatment by 2025. That's 7 years away. So that gave Congress a plan to also accelerate research together. In 2012, the first major clinical trial for prevention was initiated. And in 2013, you can't really see this, but scientists identified new genetic risk factors. So we talked about those risk genes, But on the gene, there are different specific spots that may or may not have implications for Alzheimer's disease risk. They found 20 different loci that may be involved. So the geneticists are working hard. In 2017, cognitive impairment care planning is now billable by Medicare. All of y'all, you can go to the doctor can do care planning with you, have the conversations about Alzheimer's and what is needed and what you need to get in place, what affairs you need to get in order, and what supports you can get. They can get reimbursed for that. So it pays the doctors to have the conversation. Okay, so it's accelerating. Things are going on. People are busy. But I want to talk about the latest research that came out of AAIC in London this year. So this is the hot off the press research.
AAIC picture.
And we're going to talk about it in 3 ways. So the risk for developing, early detection and diagnosis, and the clinical drug pipeline. So let's start with risk. We've already kind of talked about this, but here it is. Here's a picture of it where you talk about deterministic genes and risk genes. Okay, so you have your dad, you have your mom. Dad has a deterministic gene, mom does not. You have a 50-50 chance of getting it. It's determined. So it's a very, very high risk. This is a bigger picture of that little clip that I had in the timeline of all the different loci, susceptibility loci for Alzheimer's disease. The sociologists and the epidemiologists have shown us that underserved populations are at a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. African Americans are at 2 times the risk. Hispanics, Latinos are at a 1.5 times risk than their white counterparts. So why? Why is this? What is going on? So at AAIC this year, a new study came out that stressful events may increase your dementia risk. One major stressful event may age your brain the equivalent of about 4 years. So this was a pretty big study, over 1,000 people, but as is true in most clinical research studies, African Americans are not represented as highly as Caucasian counterparts are. They don't participate in clinical trials as much because there's a history of abuse and scandal attached to clinical trials, which is why we have protections built in place now so that these types of abuses don't ever happen again. But this trial had 1,320 adults, 82 African Americans, and about 1,200 whites. Stressful events directly correlated to poorer late life cognitive functioning. And if they, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm having a little, an aging moment. Control. When they control for education level, for age, for background, for socioeconomic status, they still found, so, if they pair people up, like they have the same educational background, they're living a similar lifestyle, they still found that African Americans had significantly more stressful events in their life. So this is just one study. More research is needed, but we're starting to understand a little bit more about how your environment and how social factors can influence cognitive health. In terms of understanding risk, the Lancet came out with a study that they believe that 33% of dementia cases worldwide could be preventable. And they look at 9 interventions across the lifespan. So at all stages of the life cycle, there are direct interventions that can be made that could lead to a lower risk of developing dementia. So that's early childhood education, education through the 11th grade, things like nutrition, maintaining heart health in midlife, and exercising, and things like making sure that a person can hear in their older years. Hearing loss is damaging, or the inability to hear. So getting someone a hearing aid could be a very helpful intervention for someone. Also, reducing social isolation for people who are older. So this is really promising. I mean, it's scary right now that we don't know exactly how to prevent Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's can't be prevented, it can't be cured, and we can't slow the progression right now. But to know that it could be preventable gives us an outline for how we can move forward with developing plans. Which leads us to the Pointer study. So a few years ago in Finland, there was a really exciting study called the FINGER study, the Finnish Geriatric Study. And it was the first randomized controlled trial that looked at how lifestyle interventions could lower the risk of developing Alzheimer's. And it showed some promising results. But Finland does not look like the United States. It's a much more homogeneous society. We are much more diverse. So the Alzheimer's Association has put $20 million behind an expansion of the FINGER study into the United States to see if we can extrapolate on that data. So this is the study to protect through a lifestyle intervention to reduce risk. It's recruiting this year. Houston is not a study site, but I hope it will be in the future. It's starting in North Carolina and California, I believe. But they're recruiting 2,500 study participants between 60 and 79, and then they're gonna look at different lifestyle interventions. So this isn't a drug study. They're gonna look at how physical exercise, nutritional counseling, cognitive and social stimulation, keeping your medical conditions managed well and controlled to the best of their ability. They're gonna do these interventions and then look and see if these people have a lower risk of cognitive decline. So this is a really, really exciting study. So, whereas before we could look at the brain under the microscope, now we can look at the brain in real time. And what scientists have found is that the plaques and tangles start to form in the brain 10 to 20 years before there are any clinical symptoms of the disease. So this is exciting. To me, this is extremely exciting because it now gives us a window of opportunity to make some interventions before the person starts showing signs of cognitive decline. So we don't wait for the heart attack to happen before before a clinician prescribes heart medicine. Maybe one day in the future, it will be like that for Alzheimer's too. We don't wait until there are clinical symptoms to be able to give some sort of drug-modifying treatment. There's a study going on called the A4 study. This is anti-amyloid in asymptomatic Alzheimer's. And they gave some drugs to people who are already in the early stages of Alzheimer's, and that's an immunotherapy drug to help clear beta amyloid out of the brain, to help lower the beta amyloid load inside the brain. But the drug was well tolerated, but people who have already experienced neuron death, you can't bring those nerve cells back. So what the A4 study is doing is looking at that drug, but in people who are still cognitively healthy. So if you enroll in the study, you get a PET scan, and it's going to look and see if there's beta amyloid inside your brain. If there's not, congratulations, good. Means you've got, that's a really good sign. But if you do have beta amyloid inside your brain, then you'll be randomly controlled into either the placebo or the drug study. So this is an exciting study too, and will hopefully lead to some better understanding about being able to delay the onset of Alzheimer's. So when we're talking about biomarkers, scientists are looking at several different areas. So they're looking at cerebrospinal fluid, they're looking at saliva, they're looking at blood. And there are a couple of really cool studies, and when we get back on, I'll be able to tell you the numbers. So one is a study that's looking at the retinal nerve fiber layer, and scientists found a really strong correlation between the thickness of this fiber layer and cognitive functioning. So what that leads me to think is that in the future, but what this is just a slide that shows how there's this strong preclinical phase, 10 to 20 years before there are any clinical symptoms. So you see cognitive functioning, it does diminish a little bit as a person ages. So a person may have a little bit of a harder time remembering things, may have a little bit of decreased attention span, but it's not nearly as significant as someone with mild cognitive impairment or dementia. So here's the quest for biomarkers. So like I said, they're looking at biomarkers in the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid. One scientist here in the medical center, Dr. Eric Tanifum, that was supported by an Alzheimer's Association grant, is trying to develop a marker that could bind to beta amyloid on an MRI. Because right now the imaging studies are with PET imaging. And PET is much more expensive, and it's not nearly as readily available as an MRI. Most doctors' offices or diagnostic clinics have access to an MRI. So if we could develop something that could image on the MRI, that would be a real game changer. They're looking at markers for CT scans. And then, as I mentioned, they're looking at molecular imaging of amyloid and tau. Tau imaging has only been online in like the past 5 or 6 years. It's still very, very new. So, all other non-invasive tests that could be used to help identify and detect early Alzheimer's disease is the smell test. So this came out at the 2016 AAIC conference, and it's the Pennsylvania Smell Identification Test. So they used almost 400 cognitively healthy people across different ethnic groups. The average age was about 80 years old. They gave them the MRI and the smell test. And then they followed them for 4 years. That's it. After 4 years, 12.6% had dementia, and almost 20% had at least some cognitive decline. Then they went back and they looked at that smell test score and looked at the MRIs. The lower baseline of the smell test correlated with cognitive decline. Now, all of you have been through, your college science classes know that correlation does not equal causation. But it gives us hope that there could be non-invasive predictors, that if you have a lower test, it may just mean that you then need to be referred to a neurologist for other types of testing. Yes. Yes, yes. I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that women are affected by Alzheimer's disease more than men are. Women are at a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. And there is like the equivalent of a task force group of scientists who are looking at why that is. So on the one hand, it could be, so age is the biggest risk factor of developing Alzheimer's, and women on average live longer than men. So it could be, that could be one reason, but it also could be something to do with estrogen levels, hormones, and scientists are looking at that too. Yeah, yes. So it's, they give different,
under fibrillum.
different scents, and you have to identify what the scent is.
She is talking to participants. Now let's turn it into a free-for-all.
I hope. I mean, but we don't exactly, but again, we don't exactly know. But the sommelier, if he starts developing changes where his palate is off, it may be a warning sign for him that, or her, that he needs to go get checked out. Yeah, yes, ma'am. Well, the test is just one moment in time. Yeah. Now, I don't know if they would give, it might be something that they give annually then. It could be something that could be built in to a clinical exam. Yeah. There were. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, that makes sense. Because vascular dementia is intimately connected to heart health. And so if he's had heart attacks and they can see where the blood loss happened on the MRI, it makes sense that they would be able to recognize that. Right, they can look at like hippocampal volume and look at like sizing things, but in terms of like looking at the beta amyloid or at the tau, that's through PET imaging right now. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, and retirees too. Sure, sure. I'm sure there are epidemiologists who are looking at different ways of analyzing that data, but I don't know it off the top of my head. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are, yes. The short answer is yes. One, for a couple of reasons. So, as I said a second ago, brain health is connected to heart health. And sugar is not good, it's not good for the heart. And when the heart oxygenates the brain, a significant amount of blood from each heartbeat goes to the brain. There are scientists who are looking at how the relationship between diabetes and Alzheimer's. Some scientists are going so far as to call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, with insulin resistance in the brain. I don't know exactly how to articulate what the actual connection is, but I do know that diabetes puts you at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's, so there is some kind of connection. Mm-hmm. Yes, Yes. He's asking about the MIND diet. And so the best evidence that we have, and this is coming from the finger study and other studies that are looking at risk, is that it's not one thing that you can do to lower your risk of developing Alzheimer's. There's no magic bullet right now. But there are evidence-based things, interventions that you can make. And what I handed to you, the little pamphlet, is just boiled down to the 10 ways to love your brain and to promote healthy brain aging. But the pillars that have been announced that are evidence-based are eating a heart-healthy diet. The MIND diet is best. It's a combination of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet for hypertension. So eating a heart-healthy diet, maintaining physical exercise, particularly aerobic exercise. It's good for the heart. It oxygenates the brain. It may help washing, cleansing the brain. Staying mentally engaged, so doing things like coming to lunch and learns. But there are other things that you can do too. What I often suggest is many of us have hobbies that we had to put down when we were younger because life got real busy. But to pick up that hobby, to do something that you love, but challenge your brain. There is some early evidence coming out that brain games can be helpful. I'm definitely not ready to say play this game or play this game to reduce your risk. But it's all part of a piece of staying mentally engaged. And then the last one is to stay socially engaged. So, and the flip side of that is that isolation is very, very dangerous. Isolation is particularly dangerous for elders and can lead both to cognitive, isolation can lead to loneliness, and it really can increase suffering. So much that the UK is ahead of us. They named a minister of loneliness, and there are actual programs in place pairing people together and phone calls so that the elders aren't totally isolated from the rest of the world. Alcohol hasn't been mentioned. Now, drinking significant amounts of alcohol can be dangerous. The MIND diet doesn't preclude alcohol. It includes red wine, a little bit of red wine. Now, the glass can't be a fishbowl. It has to be a little glass, but a little bit of alcohol may, there's research that goes both ways. The resveratrol in champagne has been shown to have some kind of protective effect. So the question, in rats or in mice. So then the question is, should we be drinking champagne? And, red wine can be helpful. And so I would say moderation is key, and to talk to your doctor about what would be best, or the level of consumption. Yes, ma'am. I'm so glad you mentioned that. It's not listed as one of these 4 pillars, but sleep is significantly important. It's significantly important because the brain repairs itself as a person sleeps. So there is some evidence that beta amyloid is taken out of the brain, and that happens during our sleep. So if sleep is interrupted, or if a person has broken sleep, that can be very damaging and can lead to a chronic sleep loss and deficit, and that can be a problem. Yeah. And on a personal level, I have a sleep apnea machine, And the difference is night and day between how you feel. Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, yes. Not to my knowledge. I really only know about amyloid in the brain. So I don't know if it's but I reckon it wouldn't be the same mechanism. But I'm happy to look that up and get your contact information afterwards, and I can look it up for you. Yeah. Yeah. So, I know this is what everybody wants. This is the big moment, the clinical trial pipeline, the clinical drug pipeline. When is there going to be a drug for Alzheimer's disease?
What treatments are available?
And there are currently no therapies that can cure the disease. Drugs temporarily improve symptoms for some people for some amount of time. So you see how conditioned that is. The last drug, as I said, came to market in 2003. So don't be fooled by drugs that are being marketed as new drugs. What they are is a combination of drugs that have already been approved. So, and they may be, I'm not saying that drug wouldn't be helpful for some people, just saying it's not, it's a different tail on the same dog. I don't know how close we are to a new drug.
Multiple drug targets graph.
There was a drug that didn't meet its goal, it didn't meet its endpoint that Eli Lilly pulled in November. But what I do know is that scientists are looking at every step of the Alzheimer's continuum to look for interventions. So scientists are looking at genetic mutation and risk factors. There are scientists in the medical center who are using fruit flies, because fruit flies have a surprisingly similar genetic profile to humans with a few important differences. And fruit flies are cheap and easy to scale. So others are looking at how beta amyloid and tau misfold, how they fold wrong, and how they accumulate, in the hopes of being able to delay the onset. Others are looking at alpha-synuclein, the dementia, the Lewy body dementia. They're looking at oxidative and inflammatory damage, so how blood vessels inflame, how chronic inflammation affects the brain. They're looking at what causes the cells to die and how we can keep cells from dying. They're looking at interventions once someone has memory loss and starts to show signs of Alzheimer's disease, how to maintain quality of life and what clinical therapeutics there are, and then what they can learn in the brain after the person dies. So scientists are looking in underneath many different rocks. What we still need is early, accurate diagnostics.
Needs and priorities in summary.
So we need to tell our legislators how important it is for these trials that are looking at non-invasive biomarkers or less invasive biomarkers like blood tests or saliva tests. We need access to providers particularly in underserved populations that may be at a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Those folks need access to health care. We need biomarkers. We need disease-modifying treatments. It can take upwards of 20 years to move from the bench to the bedside. From the clinical bench, drugs then move into animal modeling. Then they move into phase 1 studies. Many of the drugs for Alzheimer's are fast-tracked to phase 3. But there's still a lot of lag time. I don't think that lag time is wrong. We want to make sure that the drugs that we're giving to a person are at a safe dose, that the side effects are understood and can be managed. But we have to sort of facilitate the movement of these compounds to where they could be able to be taken to the bedside. So
Get involved, be part of the solution.
every one of us then has a reason to be involved and to be part of the solution. And even those of us who are not scientists can be involved in the scientific process and can be involved in increasing awareness. Whoops. So, like I said, the best way to get involved is to get involved with TrialMatch. If you sign the card today, I'll send the card to Chicago, and then you'll get an email encouraging you to fill out your profile.
Register today for TrialMatch.
If you want to fill out a profile today and cut through that middleman, you can just go to this website, alz.org/trialmatch, and do it today. It takes all of about 5 minutes, and we desperately need healthy volunteers. There's a misunderstanding that only people with Alzheimer's disease should get involved in research, but something like the Pointer study or the A4 study, if you had Alzheimer's, you'd be excluded from it. We need healthy volunteers because we need to understand what healthy brain aging looks like. Our awareness events are coming up. We have 2 large awareness events. Oh, yes, ma'am. Yeah, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It seems to be more connected with tau aggregation than beta amyloid aggregation. And scientists, so Dr. Inez Moreno-Gonzalez at UT Health is looking at how small traumatic brain injuries may still cause tau to start forming and to start developing. So we do know that concussions are a risk factor for developing Alzheimer's, and was someone who has CTE has had multiple concussions or multiple hits over the course of their life. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. It's not current. Yeah, because it's not currently funded. So people have to pay for those PET scans by themselves. Insurance companies don't cover it. Not really, no. So that's another thing to talk to legislators about. That, these diagnostics are incredibly important, and we have some of the tools for it. And so as they're putting, their influence to work, that's one avenue that they can do. Mm-hmm. It might be worth getting a second opinion. I don't know. I'm not a medical doctor, and so I would not feel comfortable saying whether it's a good idea or not. I have heard doctors on both sides of the issue kind of debate it. So, but talking to a different neurologist and just getting a second opinion or having them confer with one another might be helpful. Yes? I think it's the United States. So, and then China. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. So the walk is our biggest awareness event. It's also our biggest fundraising event. And the majority of our 78% of our money goes directly back into research. So it's free to register for the walk. It's really fun, too. So if, Alzheimer's can feel like such an isolating disease, but you come together with 3,000 or 4,000 people who are all there for the same reason. It's inspiring, and it increases resilience, and just really is an exercise in solidarity. We have another awareness event called The Longest Day that takes place on the longest day of the year, June 21st. And that's a day when you do what you love. It's all about love, the longest day. You do what you love for those you love. So you can create an event, whether you want to go dancing or play bridge or cook or go hiking. You can do anything you want. And you do that activity in honor of the person that you're caring for, that you're doing it in memory of. So for the walk, it's alz.org/walk. For the longest day, it's alz.org/longest day. So thank you for your investment of your time in learning about research. And your attendance is really an amazing sign of your dedication and commitment to ending Alzheimer's. So I want to thank you for coming. I'm happy to answer any more questions. And thank you very much.
End slide. Applause. Close.